The alien girl's screams bounced off of the cold metal walls as her reptilian captors dragged her towards the cryopod that would be her coffin. Gerald Ross was humanity's only representative on the desert planet Vidia. Even before getting the emergency summons from the Vidian High Council in the middle of the night, he knew something was wrong. Heart racing, he sprinted through the sandy streets without his exosuit, ignoring the puzzled glares from the reptilian Vidians. He burst into the council chamber, quickly bowing to the 7 elders. Then he saw her, a young Vidian girl, beaten and bound, kneeling before them. "This is Lyra, apprentice to the traitor Zolran," High Councillor Krashk said, his voice dripping with disdain. "For her master's crimes against the state, she will be executed at dawn, as is our way." "She's done nothing wrong," Gerald protested. "You can't punish a child for someone else's actions." "Vidian law is clear," Krashk replied coldly. "The families of traitors share their fate, no exceptions." Gerald's mind reeled as he scrambled for a solution. Exile, prison, anything but death. But Krashk shut down every alternative. "Her own people have forsaken her, Earther," Krashk said, towering over Gerald menacingly. "Her life is forfeit. This matter is closed." Before Gerald could respond, 2 guards grabbed him roughly, hauling him out of the chamber. As the doors slammed shut, Gerald caught one last glimpse of Lyra's eyes, wide with terror and pleading for help. He now had only hours to find some way to save her life, or her blood would be on his hands. Every Vidian had turned their back on her. Gerald was all she had left. He couldn't let her down. He wouldn't. Gerald stalked into his cramped dormitory, fists clenched and muttering curses under his breath about the cruelty of punishing an innocent girl for the crimes of her master. "What kind of fucked-up system is this?" he snarled, slamming the steel door closed behind him. "She's just a kid." But his tirade cut off as he noticed the holographic display of his computer terminal glowing and spinning, projecting the Vidian government's logo. Gerald walked over cautiously, brow furrowed. A message blinked onto the screen. "The girl is innocent. You know what to do. Z." Gerald's eyes bulged. He whipped his head around as if the mysterious messenger might be lurking in the shadows. With shaking hands he typed, "I can't just steal a prisoner. I'd be throwing away everything I've worked for." For a few tense heartbeats nothing happened, then a reply, "You'd be saving an innocent life. If you don't act, no one will. You're her only hope. Zed." Exhaling sharply, Gerald tugged at his hair, mind racing. Could he really do this? Risk his career, his life, for a girl he barely knew? But even as he wrestled with it, he already knew the answer. Steeling himself with a curt nod, he dropped to his knees and reached under the bed, dragging out his emergency rucksack. He began shoving in supplies, rations, water purifiers, a med kit, anything they might need. Next he slipped out into the dark hallway, creeping down to the maintenance closet at the far end. The lock snapped under a few hard twists from his multi-tool. Gerald grabbed a satchel of tools, slinging it over his shoulder along with the rucksack. Back in his room, he pulled up a schematic of the city's power grid, tracing a route with his finger, committing it to memory. Jaw set, he stood up, threw on the packs, grabbed a respirator mask, and slipped out into the muggy Vidian night. He stuck to back alleys and side streets, hugging the shadows, freezing at the slightest sound of Vidian patrols crunching over the sand. At last, a squat power relay station squatted before him. Glancing around to ensure he was alone, Gerald pried open a maintenance hatch and wriggled inside. The station's guts were a claustrophobic tangle of cables and humming conduits. Gerald crawled through, reciting the schematic in his head, until he reached a junction box. He popped it open and, with careful snips and twists of wire, spliced a device from his tool bag into the box. The device started to thrum, growing hot. Gerald scrambled out of the maintenance tunnel and sprinted down the alley. He barely made it a block before a boom rattled his teeth. He glanced back to see the relay station vomiting sparks and smoke, and across the city the lights flickered out in the government district. High Council chambers and prisoner holding cells, all swallowed by shadow. With the city plunged into darkness, Gerald seizes the opportunity. He sprints toward the government district, his boots thumping on the hard-packed sand. He sticks to the shadows between buildings, navigating by the map in his head, avoiding any main streets. The council chambers and jail soon loom before him, the complex now an unlit silhouette against the starry sky. Gerald pulls his grappling hook from the rucksack. With a few deft swings, he hurls it up and over the perimeter wall. It catches with a muffled clink. Gerald tests his weight against the line, then scrambles up the wall, feet kicking against the rough stone. He mantles over the top and drops into a pitch-black courtyard, kicking up a puff of dust as he lands. Gerald finds a service door, unguarded in the blackout. He slips a lockpick from his sleeve and probes the keyhole, feeling for the tumblers. The lock soon yields with a click. Gerald eases the door open and slips inside. The hallways are dark as graves. Gerald clicks on a small flashlight, keeping the beam low. He moves quickly but carefully, freezing whenever he hears the crunch of boots on sand around a corner. He ducks into alcoves and supply closets, holding his breath as Vidian guards jog past, spears in hand. After a nerve-wracking stretch of sneaking, Gerald finally finds the cell block. He peeks around a corner and spots two guards posted in front of a heavy metal door. They look anxious, tails lashing, eyes glinting in the low emergency lights. Gerald digs in his pack and produces a small metal canister. He takes a deep breath, then steps out and lobs it at the guard's feet. The canister bursts with a hiss, spraying out clouds of thick gas. The guards immediately drop, coughing and choking. Strapping on his respirator mask, Gerald runs through the dissipating gas. He slaps a disc-shaped device on the cell door lock. It sparks and smokes as it whirs. After a tense moment, the lock clanks open. Gerald throws open the door. His flashlight beam finds Lyra huddled in the corner, energy cuffs around her wrists. Her eyes go wide as she sees Gerald, brimming with desperate hope. He kneels beside her, pulling out a small multi-tool. He carefully probes the locking mechanisms on the shackles. One by one, they snap open and fall away. The instant she's free, Lyra throws her arms around Gerald, burying her face in his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispers, voice hitching. Gerald gently pats her back. "Thank me later. Right now we need to get out of here. Stay close and do exactly as I say." Lyra nods quickly, composing herself. Gerald hands her a spare rebreather mask. She straps it on as he takes her hand and leads her out, stepping past the guards still writhing on the floor. Following the same path out, Gerald and Lyra creep through the darkened halls. But just as they exit into the courtyard, floodlights snap on with a blinding glare. Alarms blare, red lights strobing across the walls. "Shit!" Gerald hisses. He pulls Lyra into a sprint toward the outer wall. Behind them, a door bangs open, and armored guards stream out, leveling rifles. "Halt!" they bellow, but Gerald ignores them. He whips out his grapple gun and fires it at the top of the wall. The hook sails over and catches. Gerald grabs Lyra around the waist and hits the reel. The grapple yanks them off their feet, sending them flying upward. Energy bolts sizzle past them, pocking the wall with molten craters. Gerald and Lyra tumble over the top and drop to the alley below. He grabs her hand again, and they take off running, darting down side streets and service paths. Shouts and pounding feet echo behind them as the guards give chase. Gerald leads Lyra through a dizzying maze of alleys, doubling back and weaving at random. They finally duck through a rusted access gate into a narrow passage between two buildings, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. The shouts of the guards fade as they pound past the hidden crevice. Gerald and Lyra flatten themselves against the cool metal walls, chests heaving as they gasp for breath. In the distance, alarm klaxons echo over the city. Searchlights sweep the streets. The night has come alive with the buzz of pursuit. But for now, pressed into the shadows of the tiny hideaway, they have a moment to breathe. Lyra looks up at Gerald, eyes shining with gratitude, even as fear still lines her face. After what felt like an eternity of harrowing close calls and nerve-wracking evasions through darkened back alleys, Gerald and Lyra finally reached the relative safety of the nondescript warehouse nestled in the industrial district near the spaceport. Gerald's heart hammered in his chest as he scanned their surroundings, making sure they hadn't been followed. Satisfied that the coast was clear for the moment, he approached a small side door and rapped his knuckles against it in a very specific pattern, the metallic clangs echoing through the empty streets. The door cracked open, a sliver of light spilling out along with a pair of suspicious eyes that immediately fixed on Gerald. As recognition dawned, the door swung open fully, revealing a burly human male who quickly ushered them inside. "Jesus Christ, Ross, what the hell did you get yourself into this time?" the man asked gruffly as he slid the bolt lock into place. Gerald leaned against the wall, chest heaving, as he finally allowed himself a moment to catch his breath. "Mike, the Vidians, they were going to execute her," he panted, gesturing at Lyra. "For something she didn't even do. I couldn't let that happen." Mike shook his head, a wry grin spreading across his weathered face. "Always gotta be the hero, don't you?" He clapped a meaty hand on Gerald's shoulder. "Well, lucky for you, I was still in port. Come on, we need to get you two to my ship. Vidian security will be locking this place down any minute now." Lyra looked back and forth between the two men, equal parts exhaustion, relief, and fear playing across her reptilian features as Mike led them into the depths of the warehouse. They wove their way between towering stacks of shipping crates, each one stamped with the stylized logo of some interstellar trading company. The air smelled of rust, engine grease, and stale recycled air. After navigating the labyrinth of cargo, they emerged into a private hangar. Lyra's eyes widened as they fell upon the ship waiting there, a battered but clearly well-loved long-haul cargo hauler, its hull pitted and scarred from countless voyages between the stars. Mike hurried up the loading ramp, motioning for the others to follow. "Gerald, get the girl strapped in back in the passenger compartment. I'll get us prepped for dust-off." Gerald nodded curtly, guiding Lyra through the ship's cramped corridors. He found the passenger seats and helped her buckle in, hands shaking from the adrenaline still surging through his veins. "Just sit tight. We'll be out of here soon," he reassured her, mustering a small smile. Lyra just nodded, gripping the seat's armrest so hard her claws left marks in the synthetic leather. Making his way to the cockpit, Gerald slid into the co-pilot's chair next to Mike, who was frantically flipping switches and inputting commands into the ship's flight computer. The engines began to thrum, reverberating through the hull. "Shit! Jerry, look!" Mike suddenly yelled, jabbing a finger at something out the forward viewport. Gerald followed his gaze and immediately felt his stomach drop. A convoy of military vehicles, lights flashing, was speeding across the tarmac directly toward their hangar. "They're coming! Gun it!" Gerald barked, strapping himself in. Mike slammed the throttle forward and the ship lurched like a beast startled from slumber, thrusters flaring. The hangar walls blurred past, and then they were soaring out over the spaceport, anti-grav engines screaming. But as they clawed for open sky, the military vehicles screeched to a halt, disgorging heavily armed Vidian soldiers. A storm of energy bolts flew up to meet the accelerating cargo hauler, stitching scorch marks across its hull and sending alarms blaring on the bridge. The ship shuddered as several bolts found weak points, piercing through into the interior. "Fuck, they're going for the engines!" Mike shouted over the cacophony, wrestling with the controls as he tried to evade the onslaught. Gerald felt a sickening jolt of panic, but forced it down. His eyes desperately scanned the chaos of the cockpit, looking for something, anything that could help. And then it hit him. Lyra cried out in fear as Gerald suddenly shot to his feet, harness straps snapping back from the explosive movement. "Stay there," he shouted over his shoulder, already sprinting from the cockpit. "I've got an idea." Heart feeling like it was about to burst from his chest, Gerald tore through the cargo bay, ripping open crates and containers. There. His hands closed around the grip of a pneumatic harpoon gun, the kind used for towing and ship recovery. Snatching up a spool of metal cable, he raced back forward. Lyra stared wide-eyed as he threw open a hatch in the cockpit's floor, revealing a claustrophobic maintenance crawlspace shot through with piping and conduits. Gerald hastily tied one end of the cable around his waist and lashed the other to a bulkhead. Then, with a final glance at Lyra and Mike, he dropped down into the crawlspace. He army-crawled through the cramped space, breath coming in short gasps, until he reached a small access panel on the outer hull. Peering through the grimy observation port, his blood ran cold. The Vidian soldiers had set up a mobile heavy weapon, its barrel already starting to glow as it locked onto the ship's engines. They'd be blasted out of the sky in moments. "So no fucking way," Gerald growled. Gritting his teeth, he kicked the access panel open, decompression alarms screaming in his ears. The wind ripped at him, threatening to tear him from the ship as he leaned out into the howling maelstrom. Bracing himself, he brought the harpoon gun to bear. Time seemed to slow as he sighted down the barrel, trying to predict the weapon emplacement's movements as both it and the ship hurtled through space. Exhaling sharply, Gerald pulled the trigger. The harpoon shot out into the night, glittering cable trailing behind it. Gerald watched, hardly daring to breathe, and then it struck home, embedding itself into the emplacement's base with a distant crunch. Working frantically, fingers already going numb in the freezing wind, Gerald lashed the other end of the cable to the hull. No sooner had he locked it in place than the ship leapt forward, engines roaring. The cable snapped taut, and then to Gerald's disbelieving eyes, it actually ripped the entire weapon clean off its moorings, sending it tumbling away into the darkness as Vidian soldiers scattered. His ears ringing and head swimming, Gerald clambered back into the crawl space and sealed the panel. He lay there for a moment, his whole body trembling as the magnitude of what he'd just done washed over him. Then, through sheer force of will, he dragged himself back to the cockpit and collapsed into the co-pilot's chair. Lyra and Mike both gaped at him, their faces a mix of awe and concern. The adrenaline finally deserted Gerald in a sickening rush, and darkness started to crowd the edges of his vision. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness claimed him was the spaceport, the military, the whole of Vidia falling away behind them as the cargo ship clawed its way up and out of the atmosphere, carrying them into the cold, silent embrace of space and stars. Gerald jolted awake with a gasp, his head pounding. Disoriented, he blinked and looked around, realizing he was in the cramped crew quarters of Mike's cargo ship. The events of their harrowing escape came rushing back, the alarms, the energy bolts peppering the hull, his desperate gambit with the harpoon gun. He shuddered, amazed they had made it out at all. A soft sound made him turn his head. Lyra sat on the edge of a nearby bunk, face buried in her hands, shoulders heaving with quiet sobs. Heart clenching, Gerald stumbled over and eased himself down next to her. He hesitantly put an arm around her trembling shoulders. To his surprise, she immediately turned and pressed her face into his chest, her tears soaking into his shirt. "I'm sorry," she choked out between sobs, her voice muffled. "This is all my fault. I never wanted anyone else to get hurt because of me." "Hey, no, shh," Gerald murmured, gently rubbing her back in soothing circles. "You didn't do anything wrong. None of this is on you." He held her as she cried, her small frame shaking against him. Gradually her sobs began to taper off into shuddering breaths and sniffles. She pulled back slightly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Lyra, what really happened?" Gerald asked softly. "Why did they want to execute you?" Lyra took a shaky breath. "My master Zolran, he wasn't a traitor. He found out that some of the High Counselors were plotting to overthrow the government, to take power for themselves. They framed him to shut him up. And me? I was going to be their example, to scare anyone else who might try to stand up to them." Gerald felt anger rising in his chest like bitter bile. "If that's true, why didn't you tell me before? We could have exposed them, stopped this." Fresh tears welled in Lyra's eyes. She shook her head. "I couldn't. They have my little brother. They said they'd kill him if I talked." Gerald's stomach plummeted as the horrible realization sank in. These monsters had a child as a hostage. Fury and nausea churned within him. He opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he possibly say? Just then the door to the crew quarters slid open, and Mike strode in, his face grim. He had a datapad in his hand, which he tossed to Gerald. "I don't need to see this," he said darkly. With a sense of growing dread, Gerald caught the datapad and started scrolling through the text on the screen. His eyes widened in shock and horror. It was a news report about the unfolding scandal in the Vidian government, detailing the arrests of the corrupt high councillors, but they're at the bottom. In a shocking twist, authorities have named Gerald Ross, the lone human diplomat on Vidia, as the mastermind behind this treacherous plot. Ross, who fled the planet after engineering the prison break of known traitor Lyra Zolran, is now the most wanted criminal in the sector. The datapad nearly slipped from Gerald's numb fingers. He looked up at Mike, mouth working soundlessly. "You've been set up, Ross," Mike said grimly. "Those council bastards must have figured out you were involved in busting the girl out, so they're pinning the whole damn thing on you." Upon hearing this, Lyra broke down again, wailing into her hands. "They'll kill him. They're going to kill my brother, and it's all my fault." Gerald felt like he might be sick. His head spun as he tried to process the staggering revelations. The room seemed to tilt around him. He set the datapad aside and slowly, unsteadily, pushed himself to his feet. "Mike," he said hoarsely, "you need to get out of here, take Lyra and go, get her somewhere safe." "Jerry, you can't be serious. What about you?" Gerald turned to Lyra and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. She looked at him with anguished, tear-filled eyes. "Lyra, I am going to find your brother. I'll get him back to you safe, I promise." "No," Lyra cried, shaking her head frantically. "You can't, it's too dangerous. They'll kill you." Gerald smiled sadly. "I have to try. I can't let an innocent child die. Not when there's even a chance I could stop it." He gave her hands a gentle squeeze, then stood and strode quickly out of the room before she could argue further. He couldn't let himself hesitate, or his resolve might crumble. As he reached the airlock, Mike caught up to him. The burly spacer held out a blaster pistol, along with some spare power cells. "You're a damned fool," Mike grumbled. "Crazy bastard." But as Gerald took the weapon, Mike clasped his shoulder firmly, his eyes saying what his mouth couldn't. "Be careful. Good luck." Gerald simply nodded, not trusting himself to speak around the sudden tightness in his throat. He holstered the blaster, took a deep breath, and cycled the airlock. The door slipped open with a hiss, and he stepped out into the cold, uncaring void of space. The lights of the Vidian city glittered in the distance, the same lights he had marveled at when he first arrived on this alien world. But their beauty was lost on him now. As he fired up his suit's thrusters and set off toward that deceptively tranquil skyline, Gerald felt an icy emptiness growing in his heart, as vast and hollow as the vacuum around him. He was acutely aware that his odds of surviving this were slim to none. He would be hunted relentlessly by both the authorities and the criminal elements in the city. The whole planet would be howling for his blood. Every soul would be his enemy. But perhaps, if he could save this one small precious life, maybe that would be enough. Maybe that would balance out the failures and mistakes that had led him here to this bleak precipice. As he flew onward, Gerald felt a bitter, mirthless smile tugging at his lips. He had joined the diplomatic corps, full of naive idealism, determined to foster peace and understanding between humans and aliens. And yet, it seemed the harder he tried to help, the more enemies he made, the more lives were shattered in his wake. Peace would have to wait. He had a promise to keep, even if it killed him. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.